Iran is also reconciled with Saudi Arabia, with Chinese has support. China supported that. And now Israel is facing a multi-front war against a huge number of different proxies. It's as difficult as the 73 war, 67. It's more difficult in some ways because the international community is different and these non-conventional wars are very different. So it's harder to defeat these groups in some ways than it was to defeat the combined Arab armies of 67 and 73.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Seth Frantzman of the Jerusalem Post war correspondent, of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and the author of the very helpful new book, The October 7 War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza, just published. I recommend for those of you who've lived the war as I have, and yet seeing it written down and broken into very clear paragraphs with names attached helps a deal remember what we've been through for nearly a year. Seth, congratulations and a very good evening to you. And I take you immediately to the evening of October 7th. I'm sure it's burned in your memory. You drove as fast as you could to Gaza, knowing that there was chaos in some fashion. You come to a police checkpoint, you stop your car, you get out, and there's a, I believe, blue car in the middle of a 4-lane highway, and there's a sack next to it. What did you find, Seth, and what are your memories of that moment? Good evening to you.
Well, good evening to you. So, yeah, that day was the evening of the first day of the war. So the war had been going on at that point for about 12 hours or so. It was getting to be sunset. And I tried to get down to the Gaza border as fast as possible. So I'd driven past some other police checkpoints near Sderot, which was closed off because there were terrorists there. And so I got to a place that was south of the city of Ashkelon. This highway, it's 4 or 5 lanes wide. And that highway goes directly towards Gaza. There's just several Israeli communities next to it, like Yad Mordechai, and there's a turnoff for Zikin and some other kibbutzim. So when I got down there, I think they had not hit me quite yet the extent of this war or what was happening. And I got to a point, because I was kind of expecting you'd see tanks or fighter planes or things. I mean, there was some rocket fire, but what really struck me was when I got to this turnoff, and there was this police cordon, and I saw in the middle of the road all of a sudden this car that was kind of lodged against the median, and it was clear all of a sudden that was not supposed to be there. And when I looked closer, it had bullet holes in it, and there was a sack next to it, and it was getting dark. So you can imagine when it's dark, it's harder to see kind of what things are. And as I got up to the sack, I realized that it was a dead body. And this body had been covered with a kind of sleeping bag or something, and some sort of debris. I guess just to cover up the face and stuff so it wouldn't be so obvious that there was a dead body there. But I later understood from people that I spoke to that they thought this was a terrorist. He'd been killed. And they were not going to evacuate the bodies because we understood at that point there were so many people that were dead, more than 1,000 Israelis, and then another 1,000 or more people from Gaza that had crossed over, terrorists mostly, that they only had space to evacuate wounded in the ambulances, and even in that case, there weren't enough ambulances because there were thousands of wounded. So those bodies were actually left there for another day or two before they were finally taken away.
The beginning of Hamas. I'm very helpful that Seth's book takes us to the history of where we came from and how it is we got to where we are. A worldwide catastrophe, ongoing. So this is the middle of the conflict or the end of the beginning of the conflict. We go to 1987, a man named Ahmed Yassin, who is deceased, I believe. Who was he, Seth? And what was his vision of Hamas?
Ahmed Yassin was one of a number of people that were Arabs, Palestinian Arabs living in Gaza or the West Bank. Some of them were born in areas that had become Israel, so they had ended up being, what was called refugees or displaced people. And they became enthusiastic in the 70s and 80s, basically about the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam. Let's remember that this is a kind of interesting era of the 80s, because remember the Mujahideen are fighting the Soviets, and there's a lot of support in the region for Islamism or political Islam, or groups that eventually would become, some of them, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or Al Qaeda, or all those things. Many of these groups have roots 100 years ago, but they suddenly became very popular. I remember that Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, had been assassinated by an Islamist. So these guys in Gaza, they basically decided that Islam would be a better answer for the Palestinian movement than what was Fatah or the other groups in the PLO. And so when 1987 came around and there was the first intifada, which started actually in Gaza, it started after a truck hit several workers, and this caused protests and riots and a cycle of violence that led to the first intifada. So some of the founders, they founded Hamas basically at that time as in their view, an alternative to the other Fatah, the other movement. But the founders of Hamas, like Sheikh Yassin is one example, but people like Yahya Sinwar and people that were around at that time, this was founded, yes, in some ways, as a religious movement, but it was also founded as a terrorist mafia type of movement. I mean, Yahya Sinwar and some of these guys, they basically earned their reputation early on in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. They earned their reputation murdering other Arabs, and they were murdering people they accused of collaboration, and they were doing it up close and personal, with their hands, strangling or killing. I mean, these people they emerged from a Khan Yunis, which was a gang-ridden town full of factions and killing. And they emerged as the absolute worst part of that. And their solution to the conflict very quickly became, basically just killing. It was killing Israelis, killing soldiers, kidnapping soldiers, killing Israelis in Gaza, and killing their other Arabs and other Palestinians. And that's basically the milieu that they came out of. And whether it's Ahmed Yassin or Rantisi or Yahya Sinwar or Sinwar's brother or Ismail Haniyeh or a whole slew of other people, that's what they came out of, and it's what they became. Most of them ended up, a lot of these guys have been killed now. Yeah, I think Yassin was killed in 2002 or 3 or 4, I forgot, but Rantisi was killed. And many of them have met an end. They met an end at the end of an Israeli assassinations, basically. But that's kind of where they came from.
Some are sent into exile, some stay in Gaza. When they return, they start suicide bombing, and then the second intifada. We're going fast because many of these gangsters haven't changed places since 87, except for now KIA. The second intifada starts in late 2000, and Hamas is not seen at this point as the major threat. That's the Palestinians on the West Bank. That's Yasser Arafat getting all the attention. I learned that Sinwar has been in Israeli custody at least once, maybe more than that, a known murderer. But because there's no death penalty in Israel, he's always been released. The last time, was he the one who was traded for Shalit along with a lot of others? Is that Sinwar?
Yeah, so Sinwar spent a long time in Israeli prisons. He learned Hebrew, he learned all sorts of other things. He certainly learned a lot about Israel. And he was released in 2011 as part of the Shalit deal. Let's remember that Hamas came to power in 2006 or so after Israel left Gaza and took out Israelis that lived there. Hamas won the legislative elections in the Palestinian Authority. And then they basically carried out a coup in Gaza in 2007 against Fatah. And prior to doing that, they kidnapped Gilad Shalit. They kidnapped Shalit, by the way, prior to actually taking over all of Gaza, which is a testimony to how powerful they already were. And Gaza was supposed to be part of the Palestinian Authority, and we're supposed to have, European peacekeepers or whatever on the border with Egypt and things like that. Hamas had already grown so powerful. They kidnapped Gilad Shalit in a raid across the border into Israel. They held him from 2006 to 2011, and then there was this deal where like 1,000 Palestinians were released, including a whole bunch of people that went on to be very important in Hamas in Gaza. And Yahya Sinwar is the worst example of it. So he very quickly became the leader of Hamas in Gaza, and the other guys that had been running it, like Ismail Haniyeh, ended up living in Doha and Qatar after traveling around other places in the Middle East.
I'm speaking to Seth Frantzman. He is the war correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. He is a member of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He is the author of a new book I recommend, The October 7 War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza, Intelligence Failure. Reading through your details, Seth, I was reminded of all the lessons learned of Pearl Harbor that were not learned, of all the lessons learned from 9/11 that were not learned. As of yet, there's been no inquiry into what went wrong and why. And many of the same leaders on that day are still in place. Some have left their jobs, but many are still there. Certainly the prime minister and the minister of defense, Mr. Gallant. But I don't want to go too fast on this. There were warning signs. You spoke to the father of one woman, now KIA, in the observation unit, the 414th. There were warnings along the fence. The fence was built to keep the Palestinian Gazan troublemakers in, not charging across the Negev. And these years in between the takeover of Gaza by Hamas and the attack on October 7th, is there one explanation that writing your book, is there one explanation that tracks you more than any other, knowing it's not definitive, about why the IDF was not able to listen to the warning signs that their own front line was giving them?
Yeah, I think it's just an example of a typical human failure of complacency combined with arrogance, combined with looking in the wrong direction, and therefore having a feedback loop in which everything that you're told, you just kind of dismiss it. And so there was a lot of groupthink at the top there. I mean, look, if you're in a room with 10 people and everyone thinks one thing, it's always worth to be the one that says, you know what, let's be contrarian, let's say it's not that. And you can look at that always in history, whether it's stock market crashes or anything else, and you can say, it's always good to have one person, say, you know what if this is not the case? So the problem that happened prior to October 7th is that there was a huge amount of information coming out of Gaza. As you said, the women observers that are part of these observation units are part of the IDF. It happens to be mostly women that are serving them, but they were watching Hamas training. Everyone knew that Hamas was training, and they were telling their officers, listen, not only are these guys training, but they're getting closer and closer to the border. They're watching us. They're collecting a lot of information on us. And these complaints just didn't get passed up the way they should have. And I think you mentioned Pearl Harbor and 9/11, but I mean, just anytime you look at intelligence failures throughout history, it's basically the same story. I mean, you'll have all sorts of examples later when someone says, well, if only we listened to this one person or these people, we could have gotten this right. But, systems are made in such a way often to kind of dismiss that type of information, especially in a system that was like Israel's, which was very much looking at Hezbollah and Iran as a threat. And Hamas is backed by Iran, but it was assumed to be a weaker threat. And let's remember, it's not just Israel. It's not just on Israel. Hamas played a role here as well because it lured Israel into a false sense of security. By training outside in the open, it pretended it wasn't being secret. And it likely sent messages via its leadership in Qatar to Israel somehow, saying that it was deterred and it just wanted money. And it had basically lured Israel into a false sense of security. So I think it's important to remember that Israel's enemies also get a vote, and they obviously accomplished a huge tragic coup here in terms of what they were able to pull off.
To tell you the scale of information that was flowing, because Israel has first-rate intelligence gathering, electronic and human. A unit called 8200, an intelligence unit. I'm following your reporting, Seth. I hope I say this right. Had the plans in general for what became Al-Aqsa flood as early as April of 2022, a year before the attack. And now that we look at it, we know that connects to Hezbollah. I think the reporting is that was a plan that was derivative of a Hezbollah penetration of the border that Hamas decided to go forward with. How did they fund it, Seth? Do we know where the money came from?
The assumption is that the money probably came from Iran or from other sources. Let's remember that Hamas is also backed by Turkey and has friends in Qatar and other places. So it had money, but I don't know if the money was the main thing. I mean, Hamas had lots of weapons. It had stockpiled them for years. It stockpiled lots of rockets, and it had. Another thing that Israel made a mistake with is that Israel assumed that the other rounds with Hamas in 2014 and 2018 and 2021, there were all these short rounds of fighting. There was an assumption that Israel had destroyed some of Hamas's underground tunnels and what they call the metro underneath Gaza. And it seems that the fact is that just a lot of the infrastructure just was not destroyed. So in the end of the day, that was something that was a big surprise, I think. And also, when we talk about gathering human intelligence and things, I think Israel's intelligence also shifted, not 8,200 other units. We're shifting towards use of more technology and less people. And one of the things about that is that technology can get things wrong. Artificial intelligence and all this, it looks cool, but it can make mistakes. And so the loss of human intelligence on the ground in Gaza was probably a setback. You mentioned the fact that Hezbollah had this plan. Hezbollah had been planning to basically invade Israel and try to take over areas in the north. Israel took that very seriously. Hamas had a similar plan. Israel just didn't really take it seriously. They saw it and they just thought Hamas is not capable of this because Hamas was the known enemy and it had been ostensibly defeated so many times. It just was not assumed to be capable of it. And that's kind of how it got away with it by basically, it's like if you look at Custer at the Little Bighorn or something. I mean, when Custer rode in, he didn't think that, he'd be overrun by thousands of Sioux warriors. I mean, he just assumed they're just not capable of this.
The intelligence failure is yet to be thoroughly investigated because the decision was made early in the war, I believe, to postpone the inquiry. There was an inquiry after Pearl Harbor right away, a lot of changes in leadership. Certainly 9/11 led to challenging assumptions, but there wasn't that much change. And Israel has kept into place the leaders that were there on October 7th. There have been resignations. But I mention all of this because the intelligence failure will come again, and you can only postpone it when you're looking the wrong way. I'm speaking with Seth Frantzman. The book is The October 7th War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. I am very pleased to be able to speak to Seth as much as I can every week about the ongoing conflict in Gaza and now the potential of conflict in the north because of Hezbollah on the West Bank, from the Houthis in Yemen, and certainly from Iran, the driver of this. There are metaphors that we need to introduce right away because they come from reporting in Seth's book. Early on, they needed a way to describe the battle plan of Hamas having attacked, but that's the battle plan of Iran. There is a mistake to be made if you concentrate too much on Hamas and not look at the octopus's brain. This is a metaphor that was used by the War Cabinet, I believe, to describe and what was going on. How does it work, Seth?
Well, Iran is obviously the head of all these proxy groups in the region. It has supported Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, as well as militias in Iraq, and as well as in Syria. Iran is at the pinnacle of its power today, under this regime, in terms of this regime's power, basically. It has been backing these groups like Hezbollah for decades. It's been slowly building them up. And over the last 10 years, it's actually had a huge amount of success. It was able to get its kind of tentacles into Yemen and back the Houthis and move drones and missiles to the Houthis so that they can fire ballistic missiles up to 1,500 miles almost. And they were able also to infiltrate Iraq after 2003, but especially in the last few years after the defeat of ISIS. Iranian militias have acquired missiles, they've acquired drones, they've been attacking U.S. forces, they're getting much more powerful. And the same thing happened in Syria, where Iran is backed the Assad regime. The Assad regime has basically won most of the war. And so Iran has backfilled all these vacuum in the region. Wherever there's a vacuum of power, Iran has kind of jumped into it. And unfortunately, the Western-backed powers like Israel or the Gulf states, and most of the Western-backed powers are basically playing defense. And even members of NATO, like Turkey, working with Iran, and so is Qatar. So that's where we see the octopus, taking over the region. Iran is also reconciled with Saudi Arabia, with Chinese has support. China has supported that. And now Israel is facing a multi-front war against a huge number of different proxies. It's as difficult as the 73 war, 67. It's more difficult in some ways because the international community is different and these non-conventional wars are very different. So it's harder to defeat these groups in some ways than it was to defeat the combined Arab armies of 67 and 73. Well, that's basically the story behind how Iran has moved all these pawns in the region up to Israel's borders.
The battle plan for Hamas, we've mentioned some parts of the leadership. It was originally, if I understand it correctly, the raiders were to hold hostages and buildings as long as possible in Israeli settlements like Sderot. That did not work out in the same fashion. Many of them fled when the IDFs and the Shin Bet started to shoot back on the 7th, although there were holdouts overnight in some parts of the Negev, and finally were neutralized the next day. But the Hamas battle plan includes retreating to Gaza and human shields, not only human shields on the street, but human shields in buildings, hospitals, mosques, schools. To your understanding, Seth, did Hamas think that the Israelis would repeat the mowing the lawn metaphors of 14, 18, and 21, would be there for a few days or a few weeks and then leave them alone? Did they think that?
I think Hamas probably knew that if you kill 1,000 people, that Israel will retaliate, more than it had in the past. I don't think Hamas actually didn't think they would be so quote unquote successful in a sense. They assigned groups of 30 or 40 men, kind of a platoon size, to attack 30 or 40 locations on the fence, and then the guys were supposed to break through and get into these different kibbutzim and places. And in some cases, the group succeeded. And when they did succeed, then they started massacring people. Usually Hamas tasked those guys with attacking the younger part of the kibbutzim where young people were, because I guess they assumed that those people would be easier targets, or maybe they might be soldiers, so it would be better to kill them first. And then they would usually go for the armory of the kibbutz, because most of these kibbutzes had a location that had rifles that could be distributed, but they knew where this was. So, if they were lucky and got in, then they committed a massacre. But in some cases, they weren't lucky. There was one place like Kibbutz Magen where a guy went out for a cigarette at 6:30 in the morning, and he saw them coming, and he raised the alarm. And then the Hamas guys were mostly killed. So Hamas the plan was basically to send these teams in, kill as many people as they could, and then bring back to Gaza as many hostages as they could get. I don't think they thought they'd get 250, but they assumed they'd get some. And then they wanted to basically, run back to Gaza and do what they've done in the past, which is sit and wait, hide underneath civilian buildings, hide in hospitals and schools, get the UN to basically run cover interference for them, and get the international community to demand a ceasefire. Then they assume that, basically that's where it would go.
5 divisions assigned to the counterattack. It takes 2 weeks to organize, but meanwhile, the IAF is very busy. The drones and the F-35s and the artillery go to work on Hamas right away. There still is some doubt as to whether Israel is going to send the IDF on a ground war. I note the 98th Division is the heavy one. The 36th Division is to the southeast of Gaza City. The 16th is to the north. There are many brigades stationed up and down the line. The first, and Seth takes us through the battle. I reported all this, but nowhere near as organized as Seth has made it for me. They begin in the north, and we walk through the neighborhoods. The first one they take on is Shujaya. Do I say that correctly, Seth? Shujaya.
I think Shujaya. Shujaya is next to Jabalia. It's one of those outside neighborhoods of Gaza City that kind of forms a ring around it. You have to get into those neighborhoods in order to get into Gaza City.
So they systematically mean to cut the Gaza in half. It's about 10 miles top to bottom. It's rolling sand, a lot of sand dunes. It's beautiful Mediterranean coast. Gaza City's to the north, Rafah's to the south. So they cut it in half, and then they work from the north south. The Golani Brigade did a lot of work. The IDF is divided, if I understand. There's the professional army, and then there are the reserves. And many of these units were the reserves doing the original fighting. I think I have this right, Seth. Was the battle plan, to our understanding from the beginning, to sweep down and have Rafah last? Was that their thinking, or did this develop as they were fighting?
Well, it seems that when they first were called upon, or in October to call up 300,000 reservists. In fact, they sent a lot of reservists to the north because they thought that Hezbollah was going to attack Israel. So there was actually a fear in the beginning there'd be a two-front war. They understood, of course, they're going to have to go into Gaza. It took a bit of time, and they had to retrain a lot of the reservists because the guys hadn't had proper urban warfare training for a while. So it took time. The plan that they don't think they had a plan for reconquering Gaza, which again shows the kind of complacency probably at the highest levels. But they dusted off plans from back in 2009 and also how they had governed Gaza before 2005. And they already had this Netzarim access because Netzarim is actually a place there had been a former Jewish community. And they already knew that you can cut Gaza in half very easily by just cutting off that road across the Salah ad-Din road, which runs north-south in Gaza. You just send some tanks there, you cut the whole place in half. It's very easy actually to do. So they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll cut Gaza in half. It'll take like a day and a half of the tanks driving across it. And then what we'll do is just slowly go into Gaza City and grind the enemy down. And the theory was, okay, that will put pressure on Hamas and that will lead to some sort of deals or something. So that's what they did. It became a very slow, systematic war. And as you noted, it started in the north, and then there was the first deal in November, the hostage deal. And then it started in the south, going into Khan Yunis, and then finally, in May of 2024, going into Rafah. And actually, even to this day, the IDF has not taken over the central camps area of Gaza. There's a whole bunch of places that they have not gone into.
Yes, Khan Yunis is the big one because Sinwar is a neighborhood kid. He never left Khan Yunis, and the command units were thickest in Khan Yunis. And Sinwar is pointed to as the overall planner here. And Khan Yunis is the one with the most elaborate tunnels. Is that correct, Seth?
It seems that that's where they found. You mentioned the 98th Division. The 98th Division is made up of commandos and paratroopers. It's an elite infantry division, basically. And it was backed up with some tanks that they provided from the 7th Armored. It went into Khan Yunis and it fought there for like 4 months or so, from November, December up until April. And they uncovered a massive amount of tunnels and all sorts of things. I think they used Khan Yunis as a kind of test bed. The IDF did to learn about how to uproot the tunnels, because the first blows they handed against Hamas in the north, I think they didn't actually know the extent of how to find all these tunnels. And the degree to which the tunnels are, from children's bedrooms, from hospitals, I mean, they're just everywhere. So, hundreds of miles of these things. And I think Khan Yunis taught the IDF a lot. And that's why when they went into Rafah, they were able to find the tunnels, I think, relatively faster.
Yeah, the fighting in Khan Yunis continued. And I remember one report you made to me, Seth, was I asked, why are they back in the north? And you said, listen, these guys just drop their weapons, change their shirt, and then move into the crowd. There are 1 million or 2 million people milling around every day, and then pick it up again in another neighborhood, pop up behind. Now, we don't have time to attend to the information war that's going on all around, but that was a major part of the conflict this last year, is dealing with the reporting, because the IDF was never secretive about what it was doing, but there were elements of the media who were manipulating the information coming out, and Seth attends to that. I want to stay with where we are on the battlefield, because there is a neighborhood that is not yet solved. It's called Rafah, and when we come back, the Philadelphia corridor, Rafah, the Rafah crossing, and Egypt. This is CBS Eye on the World with Seth Frantzman, Jerusalem Post, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and the new book, The October 7 War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. We come to Rafah in the south. All of us have experience with Rafah. I was in Rafah in 2004 with the IDF when the Philadelphia corridor was a barrier, and there were guard posts along the way, and it was my memory of the Golani Brigade and the D9s clearing a pathway outside. They were still building it. And my guard post came under attack. The Hamas or whatever they were out there opened fire. This is before Hamas took over the whole of Gaza. But they were gunmen. And the IDF just went to their firing holes and opened up back. The only time I've ever stood in the middle of a firefight, not knowing quite what to do. I remember it vividly. Rafah is a wrecked town, half in Egypt, half in Gaza. Yet we've discovered underneath tunnels. Now, the big question is, were those tunnels the explanation for the arming of Hamas and the transfer of people in and out of Gaza? There's a new question about that because many of the tunnels are closed down or not used, and there is the Rafah crossing. Seth, they're debating this all the time now, and we've talked about it. Is there a resolution in sight? Will Israel leave the Philadelphia corridor unguarded except for the Egyptians, or will it stay? And what about the Rafah crossing? What can we say about all those trucks coming through for years?
As you just pointed out, back even 20 years ago, the terrorist groups in Gaza always understood that the border with Egypt is the place to go to get weapons, to smuggle whatever you need, and to control. And the control of that border is strategic in the sense if you control the border, you probably control Gaza itself. So once Israel left, they just jumped into that vacuum and then they began to move weapons across. Sometimes they put the weapons underground, they moved them in tunnels. There were cross-border tunnels, but some of those were cut off. And then they started moving them overland. I mean, I think we have to remember that a lot of the stuff Hamas makes, like rockets, comes from dual-use material. It doesn't come across as a rocket. It comes across as things you put together, or you make it yourself. So Hamas has 20, decades of experience in this. And it seems that controlling the Rafah crossing enabled them to become as powerful as they could. It's not just about tunnels, but having the IDF presence there should be able to reduce that. I don't think Israel wants to leave now. Israel has assessed that reducing the Hamas military terrorist capabilities requires holding several parts of Gaza, but not controlling the whole thing, because apparently, Israel doesn't really want to control and run everything. And it's not even clear who the other option to replace Hamas is. At least I don't think Israel's leadership would be happy to see the Palestinian Authority there, apparently. So given those parameters, the best way to control Gaza is to control the Rafah crossing or the Philadelphia corridor. And I think Israel is thinking like that now. Maybe if there's a deal in the future, Israel would be willing to agree to some sort of a deal. But it does seem that if you leave the Rafah Philadelphia corridor, then Hamas will return to power unless you get rid of Hamas. And it does not seem that Egypt has been a great partner in terms of securing this area. Because otherwise, how did Hamas become this terrorist empire killing machine that was far more powerful than anyone imagined it could be?
The leadership of Hamas. Deif is gone. Ice is gone. You tell me Rudi's gone. Hani is gone. Mishal's still with us. But it's Sinwar. Do we believe Sinwar is in Gaza?
Yeah, I think Yahya Sinwar is in Gaza. He's from Khan Yunis. I don't think he's leaving Khan Yunis. I mean, I don't think he will leave, or let's say he's near Khan Yunis, but I don't think he'll leave his hometown. I mean, I think he's like a Pablo Escobar type. I just think that if he gets killed, he'll get killed in some place. Just like, where did Saddam go when Saddam fled Baghdad? Didn't he just go back to Tikrit? I mean, when you look at these kind of guys that are from a clan or a tribe and then that becomes a kind of mafia, which becomes a political party, which becomes a state. I just don't see those people deciding to walk away from it. So I assume that he'll die there, or he thinks he'll survive it. I don't know. He has his brothers there as well. But yeah, a lot of the Hamas, his key commanders have been eliminated. Issa's gone, and Marwan Issa, and also Mohammed Def, which was a big deal. And Ishmael Haniyeh was killed in Tehran, which is very big. Khalid Mashal is bad news, but he's been around for a while. Let's remember the Israelis tried to kill Mashal back in the 90s in Jordan. So he's already missed the bullet once. I guess he thinks that he's safe in Qatar.
And the Hamas right now remains broken and no longer a significant military unit. There were 24 battalions, as Success reporting. How many believe, what is your estimate now of how many are left inside? I know they can recruit from the Gaza population, but how many of the 24 battalions are left? 4, 2, 1, do we know?
Well, I mean, given the fact that I think that it was being people being overly optimistic on October 6th is what let the guard down for October 7th. It's always good to not be too optimistic. I think Hamas has significant resources and in terms of manpower. It can recruit. It doesn't have as many organized battalions, but I think Hamas was never meant to be a brigade battalion command structure. That's not what its roots were. Its roots was a brutal terrorist genocide organization. I just think it grew a bit too big for its britches, and then it carried out this terrible massacre. It's been reduced now to what it was. But the fact is, it was a dangerous organization in the 90s and early 2000s. So it's probably been reduced to that. But it can come back. If you allow it to come back, it will. And I think that, yes, Israel has destroyed a lot of the capabilities of Hamas. But, let's remember just historically, when the U.S. fought in Vietnam, the U.S. was very good at destroying capabilities of the Viet Cong and then VA, but that doesn't mean you win the war. You have to find a way to destroy the organization. And I think that's the challenge Israel's going to face here, is that there are diminishing returns to just defeating Hamas battalions. And Israel will have to think about what the end goal is, rather than just killing here and there a few guys, which may not bring a result in terms of an end of the story.
The book is The October 7 War. Seth Frantzman is the author. Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. I'm John Batchelor.